a letter torn, yet the door was never opened. Welcome to Mind Night, Detective. I am your host, Elderwick. Comment below and tell me where you're listening from. Your voices make these mysteries unforgettable. Let's begin. I remember that morning as if it were the echo of something I once knew but could never quite touch. The kind of morning that speaks only in half-formed whispers when the air feels too full of possibilities for a man who prefers silence. It had rained the night before, and now the wet stone of Oxford gleamed dully beneath the first light of dawn, as though the city itself was taking a slow, deliberate breath after a long night's dreams. The sound of my footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoed through the empty corridors, each step tracing the same rhythm as the others, each step drawing me further into the peculiar weight of the day. I had been wandering without purpose, or perhaps with too much purpose, through the university. Its labyrinthine halls had long since ceased to be unfamiliar, but there was something about the place that still made me feel like an outsider. The polished wood of the banisters, the distant clatter of shoes on the stone, the faint smell of paper and dust. It was all so terribly alive with its own particular rhythm, and yet devoid of the vitality I once imagined it should have. A quiet, endless waiting. It was in one of these empty halls that I first heard it, a soft, hurried conversation, a murmur that clung to the walls like ivy, or maybe it was the faintest tremor in the air stirring the silence. There were two figures at the far end, standing just beneath the high, arched windows, the light creeping around them but never touching their faces. One was a man, tall, angular, his shoulders drawn in, almost as if he were trying to fold himself into the wood of the building. The other, a woman whose voice had the peculiar crispness that often accompanies those who are too carefully rehearsed. It was a voice that could either cut through the silence or blend into it entirely. They were discussing something, a letter, I believe, though the words were not fully clear. What I did hear, and what I did not miss, was the undeniable undercurrent of urgency, the way the woman's voice faltered as she spoke, the way the man glanced back toward the door as though waiting for someone to enter. What struck me most, however, was the faint reference to something being torn from the inside. Torn, not cut. It was a strange choice of words, and for a moment it felt like a ghostly whisper that slipped from the past into the present, clinging to the air as easily as the fog. I continued on, my mind already beginning to sketch out the shapes of their conversation, a sketch that would, in the end, prove misleading, of course. But it was that kind of day, one where you take one step toward a thing, but you never quite reach it. The lecture hall I found myself drawn to moments later was as empty as all the others I had passed, save for the small scattering of chairs, neatly aligned, almost too neat, as though they had been placed there by a mind that could not bear disorder, or perhaps by one who had long since abandoned any hope of disrupting it. The hall, like all lecture halls, had a certain tragic emptiness to it, the kind that comes not from neglect but from overuse, from too many voices once raised in passionate discourse and now silenced, fading into memory. Only the faintest traces of chalk dust remained, clinging to the slate, ghostly reminders of arguments long past. I paused by the door, taking a moment to observe the room, as if I could discern its story from the way the dust settled on the wooden desks, or from the way the air felt thick, as if it had been waiting for something, or someone. And then it came to me, not as a sudden revelation, but as the slow unfolding of something I should have seen earlier. The chair by the window, the one closest to the light, was slightly askew, as though it had been moved hastily, perhaps even recently. The smallest detail, but it set the whole scene in motion. I crossed the room and approached the chair, my fingers brushing against the back of it, cold and smooth beneath my touch. As I bent to sit, my eyes caught the faintest impression left behind, the indentations in the soft, worn leather where someone had been sitting, someone who had, it seemed, left in a hurry. The whole room seemed to hold its breath, as though it were waiting for me to speak, waiting for me to understand what I could not yet grasp. I turned my attention to the desk beside the chair. There was a letter there, discarded, its edges frayed as though it had been torn. Not ripped, mind you, but carefully torn. There was something deliberate about the way the paper had been pulled apart, as if someone had wanted it to be torn, but never entirely, a thread left dangling, unanswered. I knew that kind of act, the attempt to keep something whole while simultaneously trying to destroy it. But there was something else too. A small stain on the corner of the letter, dark and unfamiliar, as if it had been placed there by an absent hand. A mark that would never quite fade. It was only then that I allowed myself to wonder what had happened here, in this space, on this morning. What had been torn from the inside? And so, the investigation began. Not with a dramatic revelation or a sudden burst of insight, but with the quiet realization that, as always, the answers would be hidden in the smallest of details. Details that only a few of us ever truly notice. The rest, of course, would be left to the ghosts of Oxford, silently keeping their watch. But I would not let them be. Not just yet. It wasn't the letter itself that caught my attention. It was the way it was handled, the way it had been left there. Tucked beneath a heavy, unread book on the desk, its edges frayed, a single corner slightly crumpled as if someone had grasped it too tightly, perhaps in a moment of frustration or fear. When I first noticed it, there was something oddly familiar about the positioning, like a misplaced object waiting to be discovered. A letter that had not been torn, not discarded, but carefully set aside, as if deliberately abandoned, a letter that wished to be found, but not yet understood. I had, by that point, been moving in and out of the professor's office for some hours, and the air had grown thick with the smell of old leather and dust. The library, just beyond the door, hummed with its own timeless quiet. Papers turning, minds at work, even though I could not remember when I had last seen anyone here. A lone figure sat at the far end of the hallway, sipping coffee as if savoring each sip as an event in itself, as if time itself could be suspended with such indulgences. That figure had not moved, and neither had I. Not much had moved, to be honest. Not yet. The letter was unopened, and yet the faintest impression of a smudge marked its surface. A smear of ink, possibly. The words were unclear, not due to poor handwriting, but because they had been altered, obscured by something, perhaps by someone, whose intentions were either far too calculating or simply far too desperate. I couldn't decide which. As I unfolded it carefully, as though the act itself would reveal some hidden truth, it became apparent that it wasn't a simple communication. No, it was something far more complicated than that. It had been written in haste, certainly, but the haste was tempered by careful restraint, a contradiction that seemed to float just beneath its surface. The first sentence was fractured, a series of words that bled into one another, a mistake, or perhaps a deliberate design. Not all words, not all promises are to be trusted, it began. A vague, poetic turn of phrase that led nowhere, and yet the message seemed clearer than I would have liked. It wasn't the first time I'd encountered such ambiguity in a letter. The sort of line that asked to be read again, as if it meant to be understood not by its meaning but by the absence of it. I turned the paper over, wondering if there was more hidden on the back, but there was nothing. Nothing except the faintest impression of a crease, as though it had been folded and refolded far too many times. It reminded me of something, a picture I had once seen of a man whose hands had grown too old for the tasks they once performed. Such hands, I thought, might fold a letter over and over until it ceased to be a letter at all, but rather an artifact of obsession. The rest of the text was no clearer, but the more I read, the more I felt its weight, its necessity. I am afraid, the letter continued, that there is no turning back now. A simple statement, but one laced with such quiet certainty that I couldn't help but wonder what had been left unsaid. What exactly had led to such an admission? And who had made it? I sat there for some time, staring at the paper, the words slowly sinking into me, trying to understand not just the message, but the context, the person behind them. What was this letter? What was its purpose? The ink had dried in places, but the stain remained in others, an uneven pattern, like a broken promise left to be examined later. The sound of footsteps behind me, soft, measured, broke my reverie. I'd not heard her approach, but I sensed her presence before I saw her, a woman whose face seemed to carry with it the weight of years spent holding things together, of secrets too carefully guarded. Eleanor Vance, the wife. There was something about her that suggested she understood the weight of things, of letters, of promises, of fears, far more than most. She spoke without greeting, her voice quiet but firm. "You're looking at it, aren't you?" I nodded, though it hardly seemed to matter whether I answered or not. I had no illusions that I could hide my interest. She had seen it too, the way the letter had been left behind, the way it almost begged to be uncovered. I could see it in her eyes now, in the way she avoided meeting mine. There was a question there, unspoken, lingering between us. But she didn't ask me. She never did. Instead, she moved to the desk, her hands brushing lightly over the surface as if tracing the path of a memory, a gesture that was as practiced as it was unnerving. "You know," she said, "not everything that seems important actually is." It was a statement, not a question, but somehow it felt as though the truth was unfolding in that quiet, almost resigned way she spoke, the kind of truth that didn't need to be shouted. She stood there, waiting, as if time had slowed for both of us, for me to make sense of what had already been left behind. And for a moment, I thought I understood. Or rather, I thought I was beginning to. But there was a faint sting in the air, a reminder that not all things are meant to be understood. Not just yet. And so, the investigation continued, one letter at a time, as quietly as the rain falling outside. I don't suppose I've ever been one for sentimentality, but there was something in that photograph, a momentary pause in time that made me look twice. It wasn't the subject, not exactly. Eleanor Vance, the wife, was unremarkable in many ways. Her presence was one of quiet restraint, and I could almost hear the tightness in her voice when she spoke, as if she were trying to hold something back. It was the photograph itself, I suppose, that made it stand out. Its faded edges, the slight discoloration from years of neglect. And then, of course, there was the woman standing beside her husband, her arm draped over his shoulder, her face a little too blurred to be a perfect memory, but clear enough to be meaningful. It was tucked inside an old, leather-bound book on the shelf, nestled there as if it had always belonged. A relic, a symbol of something long past, though what that something was, I couldn't say. I had been wandering the room, letting my fingers brush across the spines of countless volumes, trying to find some pattern, some unspoken connection. The office had that musty, time-worn smell of any place that houses history, a place where things are kept out of view, only to be uncovered when someone, like me, comes looking for them. The moment I saw the photograph, I had the distinct feeling that something had shifted. Something had moved just enough to be noticed, but not enough to be understood. It was a feeling I've come to recognize, one of those quiet shifts in the air that signals a truth being just beyond reach. I stared at the photograph for a moment longer than I should have. Eleanor was leaning against her husband, a man I had not yet met, but whose presence in the room was impossible to ignore. The older version of him was easy to picture, more worn, perhaps a little grayer, but there was something about the way he held himself in the picture. It was the kind of posture that seemed to say, "I belong here," and I was suddenly struck by how little I knew about the man who had died. He had not, I was beginning to realize, left much of himself behind. The woman in the photograph was not Eleanor, I noticed. At least, not in the way she had appeared when I first saw her. Her features were sharper, her expression more confident, but there was a quiet sadness in her eyes, a shadow that made her more intriguing than any of the others. She had the same dark hair as Eleanor, but there was something different about her. Something more alive, perhaps, or more real. Eleanor, for all her careful restraint, had a kind of distance that the woman in the photograph did not share. I placed the photograph back in its resting place, though I had the distinct feeling that it was waiting for me to understand something about it. I had no proof, no immediate conclusion to draw, but there was something there, a slight shift in the way Eleanor had spoken when I mentioned it. She had hesitated, just for a moment, and in that brief pause, I could feel the tension in her body, the way her fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. It was nothing overt, nothing that would stand out to an untrained eye, but to mine, it was as plain as the room we were in. I began to wonder if that photograph was a clue, or perhaps a reminder of something Eleanor had long since tried to bury. She was the kind of woman who had spent a lifetime carefully arranging the pieces of her life, as if she were trying to make sense of it all by controlling the narrative. It was all too familiar. The way she maintained her composure, the way she spoke with that almost too perfect politeness. And yet, beneath that, I could see the faintest flicker of something else, something I couldn't quite name. Later, when I asked her about it, her response was as composed as I had expected. She spoke of the photograph with a sense of detachment, as if it were a mere relic of the past. A different time, she had said, her gaze distant as if she were already far from the moment we were sharing. But the way her lips tightened ever so slightly, the faintest tremor in her voice, told me more than her words ever could. What, I wondered, had the photograph been hiding? What had it come to represent? For Eleanor, it was a past she had long since closed off, but for me, it was a puzzle I couldn't leave unsolved. The woman in the photograph was no longer a mystery to me. She was someone who had been at the edges of this story all along, waiting to be recognized. It was becoming increasingly clear that the past was not something that could be easily ignored, not by anyone involved. And yet it remained as distant as the quiet rooms of Oxford that I so often wandered through. There were answers in that photograph, of course, but I had yet to uncover them. For now, they were simply another layer to be peeled back, another detail that would eventually reveal its meaning in time. But that time, I knew, had not yet arrived. The thing about a case like this, and I've seen it before, is that it never announces itself all at once. It isn't a revelation so much as a gradual gathering of quiet facts, pieces that drift toward you like leaves caught in the wind, their paths uncertain but inevitable. They land in your mind in odd ways, too small to be noticed, too subtle to be fully understood at first. It's the spaces between them that matter, the silences that stretch just long enough for you to hear them. And so, like a slow breath drawn deep into the lungs, the case began to unfold in a way I hadn't expected. I had not anticipated the significance of a brief conversation with Dr. Montague. The man was an enigma. Intelligent, certainly, but there was something unnerving about the way he avoided the center of things, as if the world's problems were too beneath him to examine too closely. He spoke little, and when he did, his words seemed calibrated to keep his distance from the matter at hand. A man who found his pleasure in subtlety, a connoisseur of evasions. But there was a truth in his manner that intrigued me, an unease that wasn't so much hidden as it was merely unspoken. It made him, in a way, almost as interesting as the people he tried so desperately to avoid. The day I met him in the library, I'd been intending to search through a collection of journals related to the university's history. The smell of old books, the sort that haven't been opened in years, lingered in the air, as did the weight of time itself, pressing down on everything. Montague was sitting in one of the far corners, a book open in front of him but his gaze far away. I noticed, as I often do, the smallest things first, The crease in his shirt, the way his fingers drummed lightly against the cover of his book as if seeking a rhythm that wasn't there. But it was his eyes that caught me. They were darting around the room as though someone was out of place. I made my way over to him slowly, allowing the silence between us to grow, as silence is often the best way to invite conversation. When he saw me, he didn't flinch, but there was a brief tightening around the edges of his mouth, the smallest twitch of discomfort. He knew who I was, of course. Everyone at Oxford seemed to know me, though not everyone seemed to appreciate my presence. I nodded in his direction, and after a moment he returned it, his gaze flickering briefly to the book in his hands, and then back to me. I asked him about the case, about the victim, trying to sound casual. The same questions I'd asked everyone else. How well did he know the man? Was there anything unusual in his behavior recently? Montague's response came as I'd expected, with the same detachment. I didn't know him well, he said, his voice cool. Though I did hear he had become obsessed with something, some sort of mystery, I suppose. But that's hardly surprising, is it? Everyone has their obsessions. There it was. His offhand remark, barely more than a whisper beneath the words. Everyone has their obsessions. The idea of an obsession, a clue left to hang in the air with all the subtlety of a bird in flight. It wasn't so much what he said as the way he said it. Casual, detached, but there was something there, something hidden beneath the surface. I hadn't noticed it at first, but as he spoke, I could feel the words take root in my mind, turning slowly, quietly, like a stone sinking into water. I asked him, in the most nonchalant way I could manage, what exactly the victim had been obsessed with. Montague paused for just a moment, his eyes narrowing as if considering how much he ought to reveal. A letter, he said, almost dismissively. Something he'd found. A letter, or perhaps several, I'm not sure. He thought they meant something. He thought it all meant something. His lips pressed into a thin line and the casualness slipped from his voice. But then, of course, people always do, don't they? It was that pause, the one between his words, that made my mind click into place. There was a pattern there, a hesitation that suggested he knew more than he was letting on, but he had said it so simply, so matter-of-factly, that I had almost missed it. The letter. The obsession with something the victim had found. That remark, the way Montague had let it slip, was the first real thread of the case that I had tugged on since the victim's death. It was, as I would later realize, the first breadcrumb. But there was more. The way Montague shifted in his chair after speaking, the way he looked down at the book in his hands as if he'd said too much. Too little of it made sense. Yes, I said, almost to myself, everyone does have their obsessions. I walked away slowly, not letting my mind fixate too much on his words just yet, but they followed me like shadows, lingering in the back of my mind obsession. Letters, secrets buried in words, waiting to be uncovered. The rain had begun again as I stepped outside, and I paused under the archway, letting the coolness of the air settle into me. Montague's words had echoed in my ears long after the conversation had ended, as words so often do. I felt suddenly as though I were standing at the edge of something, not quite understanding it, but knowing it was there, just beyond my grasp. The case, I thought, would not be so easily solved. But then, I suppose it never is. Oxford had always held a peculiar sway over me, as though it were a place both familiar and foreign, a city suspended between time and memory. Each step down the cobbled streets seemed to whisper echoes of long-forgotten conversations, the kind of conversations that were never meant to be overheard, but somehow stuck with you nonetheless. There are times, I suppose, when the weight of history presses a little too closely, and you begin to sense that every shadow, every turn of the corner, hides a story of its own. It was a sensation I had often tried to dismiss, but this case, This particular case seemed to provoke it at every turn. I had been mulling over the photograph I had seen in the professor's office, the one with Eleanor Vance standing beside her husband. The woman in the picture, the one who wasn't Eleanor, had haunted me in the way only memories do. It wasn't just her face, nor the peculiar sadness that lingered in her eyes. It was the sense that she had a role in all of this, a role I couldn't quite define. She was someone who had been here, but was no longer, and yet her absence seemed to hold the key to something I hadn't yet fully understood. The afternoon was fading, and the rain had started to fall again, the sound of it pattering against the stone walls like 1,000 whispered secrets. I found myself in the university library, the smell of old books hanging thick in the air. It was here, amidst the musty shelves, that I came across something that, for a moment, seemed to shift the whole perspective of the case. A dusty ledger, tucked away on the bottom shelf of a rarely accessed section of the library, caught my eye. The name on the cover, Vance, was enough to make me stop. There was a brief moment when I thought I should leave it untouched, as though it were an artifact too fragile to disturb. But the nagging feeling that had been growing inside me, the one that told me I was circling something, finally pushed me to open it. The ledger contained records of various correspondences, all signed by the same name, a man named Charles Lambert. The name was unfamiliar to me, but as I turned the pages, I began to recognize the tone of the letters. There was a sense of urgency in them, a quiet desperation that seemed to pulse through the ink. Lambert had written repeatedly to Professor Vance, though the letters were never answered. Each one was a plea, pleas for help, for understanding, for answers that Vance had either ignored or forgotten. The more I read, the more I began to wonder whether Lambert had ever truly expected a response, or if his letters were merely a way to keep the past alive. I turned to the final entry, and there, written in the margin, was a note in Vance's hand. Not worth pursuing. Leave it be. The words were simple, but the dismissal carried a weight that seemed disproportionate to the briefness of the statement. It was a casual remark, made in passing, yet it seemed to say so much more. As I closed the ledger, I couldn't shake the feeling that Lambert was more than just a footnote in Vance's life. No, Lambert had been something, someone, whose presence had been erased from the narrative. And it was then, as I walked out of the library, that I remembered something I'd heard earlier in the case. Eleanor had once mentioned an old friend, someone her husband had known long before she came into the picture. Someone, she said, who had been too much a part of the past. She had dismissed it then, just as Vance had dismissed Lambert, but the words stuck with me. I sought out Dr. Montague again, the subtlety of his earlier remark still lingering in my mind. I had learned by now that when something doesn't quite add up, it's often best to go back and ask the right questions, not directly, but from an angle, as you would circle around a puzzle. Montague's aloofness, his distaste for direct confrontation, made him a peculiar source of insight, but there was more to him than met the eye. I asked him about Vance, about his past, about anything that might explain the letters, the silence, the mystery that seemed to hang around the man. Montague responded in his usual manner, half apologetic, half dismissive. But as he spoke, I noticed the slight flicker in his eyes, the smallest hint of something, a momentary break in his composure. Vance, Montague said, his voice quiet, always seemed to avoid certain things, certain people. His past was difficult, best left forgotten. And there it was again, another offhand remark, as if brushing aside an inconvenient truth. But Montague's words carried more weight than he likely realized. Vance's past, difficult as it might have been, was not something he could simply outrun. The question was, what had happened to Lambert? Why had he been erased from the story? As I stood there in the fading light of the library, I felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift. There was a connection between these crossed paths, a thread that ran deeper than either Vance or Lambert could have known. The only question that remained was whether I could pull on it far enough to uncover the truth, or whether the truth would remain as elusive as the past itself. I walked away with more questions than answers, but for the first time I felt the direction of the investigation shifting, just enough to see the faintest outline of what might lie ahead. The past, I knew, was never truly gone. It lingered in the margins, waiting to be uncovered. The thing about red herrings, and I've encountered more than my fair share, is that they're rarely as obvious as one might expect. The trick isn't in their presence, but in the way they seduce you, offering just enough to mislead without ever fully satisfying. A simple gesture, a fleeting comment, a sliver of detail, that's all they need to plant a seed of doubt, to send your mind chasing after the wrong conclusion. I'm sure most people never notice them, but for those of us who live in the quiet corners of the mind, they're as impossible to ignore as the steady ticking of a clock. I remember the moment well. An afternoon drenched in rain, the kind of relentless drizzle that makes Oxford feel both alive and ghostly at once. I had been sitting in my office, staring out at the grey haze that had settled over the spires, when the phone rang. The voice on the other end, breathless and hurried, belonged to none other than Dr. Montague. "I think you should come," he said. "I believe we've uncovered something." At the time, I thought little of it. Montague was the sort of man who often misunderstood his own emotions, and when he spoke in such a flustered manner, it only confirmed my suspicion that whatever he had uncovered would likely be inconsequential. Still, I made my way over to his office, more from curiosity than a real sense of urgency. It was, as expected, a mess. Papers scattered across his desk, books half open, their pages turning in the wind from an open window. But there, amidst the disarray, was a letter that had somehow made its way into Montague's possession. A letter from someone named Lila Ward, an artist who had been a friend of the late Professor Vance. At least, that was the official story. The letter, however, told a different one. "I know what he's hiding," it read. "I'm coming to see you. You must tell me the truth before it's too late." The message itself was simple, a plea for answers. But it was what came next, the timing of it, that made it worth a second glance. Montague seemed to believe it was a breakthrough, the final piece of the puzzle, and for a moment I considered it. A name, a possible link to Vance's mysterious past. A person whose presence in his life had somehow been erased, hidden behind layers of obfuscation. But as I sat there, the faintest echo of something else flickered in the back of my mind. I thought of the earlier remarks from Eleanor, her offhand comment about the old acquaintances Vance had left behind. I thought of the photograph, the one with the woman standing beside her husband. Too familiar, too careful. It all seemed to fit, like the brush of a painter's hand gliding over an incomplete canvas. But something didn't quite sit right with me. It was too easy. The letter felt too clean, too neat a connection for someone whose life had been, by all accounts, much more complicated. I leaned forward, studying the paper again, the smudge of ink on the page. It was there, just on the edge of my vision, the slight inconsistency in the handwriting, a faltering stroke of the pen, as though the writer had hesitated before putting the words down. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was enough. Enough to make me think that this was not a message of urgency, but a deliberate distraction. I set the letter aside, standing and turning toward Montague, who was still watching me with that slightly hopeful expression, as though expecting a sudden revelation to emerge. He was, I realized, as much a part of this tangled web as anyone else. "Dr. Montague," I said slowly, my gaze drifting over the disarray of his office. "This is a diversion, a well-placed, carefully timed diversion." His face faltered just for a moment, as though the truth had briefly flickered behind his eyes. But then he quickly recovered, smoothing his brow. "You're sure?" he asked, almost too casually. "Quite sure," I replied. "This letter is meant to pull us in the wrong direction. It's a red herring, plain and simple." And so it was. I walked out of his office with more certainty than when I'd entered, though the path ahead seemed no clearer. Red herrings are never as straightforward as they seem, and this one was no exception. It wasn't a misdirection that was meant to confuse, but to steady, just long enough to keep us chasing shadows. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets slick and glistening in the dull light. I paused for a moment, taking in the quiet hum of the city. The case, like the rain, had cleared the air in some ways, but only just enough to reveal the next set of questions, unanswered and waiting. There are moments when time seems to stretch, like the pause between a breath before you realize you've been holding it too long. This was one of those moments. It was an ordinary afternoon, the sort that Oxford seems to specialize in, neither too hot nor too cold, the kind that slips by unnoticed, leaving only the faintest imprint. But when I returned to the office, there it was. A letter, hastily opened, its contents scattered across my desk as if someone had left in a hurry. The letter wasn't what had caught my attention, though. No, it was what it contained. Pages, notes, an unfinished sentence that made me stop, made me pause just a little longer than necessary. The paper was old, its edges worn with time, but there was something unsettling about the way it had been handled. A careless tear, an incomplete fold, as if someone had hastily left something behind, knowing it would come back to haunt them. I sat there for some time, the rain tapping softly on the window, allowing the moment to settle around me, like smoke from a cigarette left too long in the air. And then it struck me. There was something missing. One page, to be precise. It had been torn away from the stack of notes, leaving only a jagged gap. A deliberate omission, of course. A page had been removed, just as carefully as one might remove a speck of dust from a carefully arranged bookshelf. It was small, that missing page. Too small, I thought, to be of much importance, except that it wasn't. A missing page is never just a triviality, never a simple accident. It tells a story all its own, one of intention, one of purpose. I couldn't help but wonder what had been so crucial that it needed to be hidden, erased from sight. I turned the remaining pages over, my fingers brushing lightly over the surface of the paper. There were no markings on the first few, no clues or distractions. But as I moved further through the stack, I found something. A word, just a single word carefully underlined, as though the writer had wanted to highlight its significance. Regret. It was a curious word, one that carried weight without shouting its meaning. A simple word, yes, but one that spoke volumes when placed in the context of a life left incomplete. I had seen that word before, though I couldn't remember where. It seemed somehow familiar, as if it had been part of a conversation I'd overheard or a letter I'd read long ago. But no matter how hard I tried to place it, I couldn't. It was just a fleeting impression, a shadow slipping through my fingers like so many other pieces of the puzzle. I leaned back in my chair, contemplating the missing page, wondering what secrets it might hold. But the more I thought about it, the less it seemed to matter. The missing page wasn't the key to the mystery, not in itself. No, it was simply a part of a much larger story, one that had been carefully constructed over the years, layer by layer, piece by piece. I walked to the window and looked out at the grey sky, the wind moving through the trees like a silent witness to the unfolding of events. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with the promise of more. It seemed fitting somehow that the story I was unraveling had come to this point. The missing page, the word regret, the sense that something had been lost in the past, hidden away, never to be fully recovered. The door to my office creaked open, and I turned to see Lewis standing there, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak right away, but there was a quiet understanding in his eyes, a recognition that the case was moving into darker territory. I nodded, but didn't say anything. I didn't need to. We both knew what had to come next. I looked back at the stack of papers on my desk, the missing page still a haunting absence. It wasn't a clue, not in the conventional sense, but it was the kind of thing that lingered in the air, just enough to make you uncomfortable, just enough to remind you that not everything is as it seems. "Find the page," I said quietly, "the one that's missing. And whatever it tells us, it's not going to be what we think." Lewis didn't ask why, didn't question it. He simply nodded, and as he closed the door behind him, I sat there, staring at the space where the missing page should have been. It was funny, really, how something so small could hold so much weight, how one small piece of a story could pull everything else out of alignment, and I, like always, was left to follow it. There's a peculiar quiet to the libraries at Oxford, a silence that feels more like a presence than an absence. It's the kind of quiet that fills your ears, presses in around you, until the only sound you can hear is the rustling of old pages turning, the soft scrape of a chair against the floor, the whisper of a breath caught between the rows of bookshelves. It was in this particular silence that I found myself again, walking slowly between the towering shelves of the Bodleian Library, as though the building itself had swallowed my thoughts whole and now returned them to me in fragments. I'd been here before, of course. One does not spend years at Oxford without developing a certain familiarity with the musty smell of old books, the feeling of worn leather under your fingertips. But today, it felt different. Today, the silence was more profound, more suffocating. It was as though the walls themselves were listening to the unfolding of this case, waiting for me to find the one thing that had eluded me. I'd been mulling over the letter from Dr. Montague again, the one that had promised so much yet revealed so little. The words seemed to echo in my mind with a kind of hollow clarity. He knew something. He was searching for it, but he couldn't find it. I'm afraid it's already too late. A message, yes, but one that held no real answers, only the barest suggestion of a truth I couldn't quite place. It had haunted me, that phrase, "too late," as if it had been placed there deliberately to make me question everything I thought I understood. I stopped at one of the larger tables, where a scattering of papers lay untouched, the only evidence that someone had recently been there. The weight of the library pressed in around me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though no one was near. It was a sensation I had learned to ignore in my years of investigation. But today, it felt different. There was something in the air, something waiting to be uncovered. I began leafing through the papers, not expecting to find much, but with the hope that perhaps there was something I had missed the last time I was here, and there, tucked between two heavy volumes, was a single sheet of paper, its edges frayed with age. The handwriting was familiar, so familiar, in fact, that it made my breath catch in my throat. It was the hand of the victim, Professor Vance. I unfolded the paper carefully, feeling the weight of it, the weight of its significance, as though the letter might reveal more than just words. The page was a journal entry of sorts, but it was incomplete, like the start of a thought that had never been fully realized. The words were fragmented, just enough to make sense, but not enough to offer anything of real substance. The truth is somewhere hidden here, between the words and the silence. There is a secret locked in the past, but it is not one that can be easily unlocked. I have tried, but the more I search, the further it slips from my grasp. The sentence ended abruptly, as though something had stopped him from finishing. The words, too, seemed to pull away, as if they were meant to remain unfinished, to remain hidden. I turned the page, hoping for more, but found nothing. Just the blankness of the next page staring back at me, as if the secret he had been searching for had never been written down at all. It was maddening, this sense of something almost within reach, yet always just beyond my grasp. It wasn't the words themselves that unsettled me. It was the way the letter had been left. Tucked between those books. Hidden in plain sight, almost as if the professor had wanted someone to find it, but not yet, not until it was too late. It was a deliberate act, a final gesture of defiance, or perhaps one of resignation. I closed the letter slowly, my mind racing. I'd thought I understood Vance, his obsessions, his quirks. But this letter, this incomplete thought, suggested something more, something darker. The search for the truth, it seemed, was not a simple matter. It was a labyrinth, a web of half-truths and hidden meanings, each thread pulling in a different direction, each question leading only to more questions. I glanced around the library, its vast emptiness surrounding me like a vast, silent witness. The faintest whisper of a footstep reached my ears, and I turned sharply, my hand still clutching the letter, but there was no one there. Just the empty rows of books, the dust settling like memories in the air. It was then that I realized there was something else, something more insidious than I had first suspected. The truth was not hidden in the letter alone. No, it was in the very structure of this case, in the way things were left out, in the things that had been erased or discarded, in the silences between the words. As I walked away from the table, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was still watching me, waiting for me to understand. The case had changed once again, but I had no way of knowing how much deeper it would go. And yet I couldn't help but feel that the answer was buried somewhere in the labyrinth of the past, waiting to be found. For now, though, it remained as elusive as the silence in the library. It's often said that the final clue is the one that brings it all together, the piece of the puzzle that makes everything else fall into place. But that isn't quite true. Not for me. The final clue, when it does arrive, doesn't tie up the story neatly. Rather, it holds the weight of all the moments that came before it, the silences and the unanswered questions. It's the moment when you realize the case was never about what you thought it was about, and you're left with a kind of quiet disillusionment, a final piece that is as much an enigma as the puzzle itself. I had spent the better part of the afternoon in the university archives, rifling through dusty volumes of old records, trying to trace any scrap of information that might lead me back to the heart of this case. The rain had come again, a soft, steady patter on the windows that seemed to match the rhythm of my thoughts. The library, as it so often does, had swallowed me whole, and for a moment I'd forgotten just how much time had passed. I had thought I was close, so close, but still, the truth eluded me. Then, just as the afternoon began to fade into evening, it came to me, as quiet and unassuming as a shadow slipping through a crack in the door. I had been reading a letter, or rather, what was left of it, a torn and crumpled piece of paper, barely legible, but enough to spark something in my mind. It was dated the day before the professor's death, and the signature at the bottom was familiar. Lila Ward. The same name that had appeared in Dr. Montague's letter, the same name that had been linked to the professor in passing. But what struck me about the letter wasn't its contents. It was the absence of one word, a word that should have been there, one that would have completed the sentence, but was missing, just as something had been missing in every step of this investigation. The sentence was incomplete, a fragment that read, "I can no longer ignore what I know to be true. The secret we both..." And then the paper tore. The rest of the message was gone, and I found myself staring at that empty space, that gap where the word should have been. The word. It was there, just out of reach. The final piece, but the paper refused to give it up. I'd read the sentence over and over again, trying to find some meaning in its emptiness. There was a subtlety in its phrasing that suggested more than just a simple confession. It hinted at a deeper connection, a shared secret that had been kept hidden for far too long. And yet the missing word remained, a silence that echoed through the sentence like a scream held behind a closed door. I had been so focused on the details of the case, on the people and the clues, that I had overlooked this simple, crucial fact. The missing word was the key to understanding everything. I closed the letter slowly, letting the weight of its absence sink in. The case had been a puzzle, yes, but this was something else entirely. A gap, a silence, a void where meaning should have been. It was as though the case itself had been designed to make me overlook the most obvious thing. The missing word was the clue I'd been searching for all along, and yet it had never been written down. It was a piece of the story that could only be understood through the spaces in between, through the things left unsaid. It wasn't just the letter that had led me here. It was everything that had come before it. The photograph, the missing page, the whispered words, the unspoken connections. Each fragment, each detail had pointed to this moment, to the realization that the truth had never been something solid or tangible. It had always been elusive, hidden in the gaps, waiting for someone to notice the silence. I sat there for a long time, the letter still in my hands, the weight of its missing word pressing down on me like the silence of the library itself. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy with clouds, the fading light casting long shadows across the room. It was then that I realized the truth of it, that the final clue was never meant to be found, not in the way I had expected. The case, like the rest of life, had unfolded in pieces, each one leading to the next without ever offering a full picture. It wasn't a puzzle to be solved, it was a story to be understood. I stood up slowly, my thoughts still swirling around the missing word, the unspoken truth. The door to the archives creaked open behind me, and I turned to see Lewis standing there, his face unreadable but his eyes alert. I knew without asking that he had been following the case as closely as I had, perhaps with a different perspective, but just as determined. "Have you found it?" he asked, his voice low, as if he too understood the weight of what had just passed between us. I nodded, though the answer was more elusive than any simple yes or no could express. "I've found the truth," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "But it's not what I thought it was." And with that, we both stood in the quiet of the library, the final clue now understood, but still just out of reach, as much a part of the mystery as it ever had been. If I've learned anything from my years of walking the shadowed halls of Oxford, it's that people rarely hide the things they want to hide in the places you'd expect. The truth they bury don't lie behind locked doors or beneath layers of formalities and polite conversation. No, they hide in plain sight, behind small gestures, in the pauses between words, in the faint tremor of a hand just before it steadies. And if you're careful, if you pay attention to the things that others overlook, you can sometimes glimpse the heart of the matter, beating silently beneath the surface. I'd come to understand this case in fragments, like a painting that had been carelessly torn into pieces, its meaning obscured by the jagged edges of what was left. Each clue, each person I questioned, had added another layer of uncertainty. The photograph of Eleanor and the other woman, the missing letter, the incomplete journal entries, all of them pointed to something I had yet to fully grasp. And yet, as the days went on, it became more and more clear that this was not a puzzle of motives or opportunity. No, the heart of this matter was something else entirely. I sat in my office late that evening, staring at the pages spread out before me. They were the same papers I'd seen countless times before, notes from Montague, letters from Lila Ward, the odd fragments from the professor's journals, but now they seemed to carry a weight I had only just begun to appreciate. The rain had returned, gently tapping at the window, and for a moment the sound seemed to drown out everything else, as if the world itself had quieted in anticipation. Eleanor Vance had remained an enigma throughout this case. She was composed, calculating even, but beneath that veneer of control, there was something else, something that, for all my observations, I had failed to see until now. It wasn't just her aloofness, her constant air of restraint. It was her ability to remain untouched by the world around her. She spoke of the professor's death with a detached sorrow, the kind that suggested she had already moved on, as if the past was something she had left behind long ago. But that wasn't the part that concerned me. No, what had begun to gnaw at me was the way Eleanor had moved through this investigation. She had been too quiet, too absent from the crucial moments, and yet always present in the spaces between. She had known more than she let on, I was certain of it. But it wasn't until the final conversation I had with her that everything began to fall into place. I had visited her at her home, late one evening under the pretense of gathering more information. She had greeted me with the same polished politeness, the same restraint. But as I spoke to her, something shifted. Perhaps it was the tiredness in her eyes, or the way her gaze flickered just a moment too long when I mentioned the other woman in the photograph. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make me realize that she had been playing a game all along, one whose rules I had never quite understood. There was a moment, right at the end of our conversation, when I asked her about her relationship with Lila Ward. The question was straightforward, nothing more than a formality, nothing I hadn't asked before, but it was the way she responded that caught me off guard. Her voice wavered ever so slightly as she spoke of Lila. "She was a friend," Eleanor said, the words carefully chosen, but there was a shadow that passed over her face. It was subtle, a fleeting flicker of something deeper, but it was enough to confirm what I had suspected for some time now. Lila Ward was not just a friend, she was something more. She had been a part of their lives, part of something far darker than Eleanor had been willing to admit. I had seen it in the way she had been mentioned, in the way her name had been left out of the story until it was too late. Lila had been at the center of this web, and Eleanor had known it all along. But it wasn't until that moment, when she hesitated just a fraction of a second, that I understood the true depth of their connection. Eleanor had never fully accepted the loss of Lila, and in that loss, she had carried a secret, a truth she had buried so deep that even she had almost forgotten it. The professor's death was not just the end of a life, it was the end of a chapter that had been written long ago, a chapter that involved more than just him. Lila's disappearance, her absence, was the key to it all. It was the secret that had haunted Eleanor for years, the truth she had tried so desperately to hide. I sat back in my chair, staring at the empty glass of whiskey in front of me. I'd come so far, yet there was still so much left unsaid. I had the pieces, but the picture was still incomplete. The final clue was not the one I had expected. It was not found in a letter or in a whispered confession. No, the heart of this matter lay in the spaces between the words, in the secrets left unspoken, in the quiet gestures that no one else had noticed. I knew now what I had to do. The case was not over. It had only just begun to reveal its true nature. And as I looked out the window, the rain still falling softly outside, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. I would uncover the truth, one piece at a time. There are times when the truth arrives with such quietness that it is easy to mistake it for something less. No grand revelations, no sudden confrontations, just the slow, steady unfolding of the inevitable, as if it had always been there, waiting patiently for the right moment to be understood. That evening, the truth didn't speak loudly. It simply sat in the air, like the dust settling in an empty room, like the rain pattering against the stone outside. The end of the case, I suppose, was always destined to be quiet. For in the quietest of conclusions, the loudest of truths are often revealed. The days following my conversation with Eleanor Vance had passed with a strange stillness. There were no more questions, no more hastily written letters or photographs that begged to be understood. The silence, once unsettling, had become an old companion, one I had grown used to over the years. The hours spent in that sterile office, the faint scent of old books, the quiet hum of the city beyond. It all blended together, the days fading into one another without ceremony. But as always, it was the absence of something that called my attention, not the presence. I'd begun to accept that this was the nature of the case, the nature of all cases, really. The answer was never as neat as we would like to believe. And yet something nagged at me still, something I couldn't quite place. A letter had been found, yes. The truth of Lila Ward's involvement had become clear, and Eleanor's quiet complicity had been acknowledged. But there was more, a piece that I hadn't fully grasped, a final detail that eluded me. It was when I returned to the professor's study, for what felt like the 1,000th time, that I found it. The moment was inconspicuous, nothing more than a glance across a shelf of forgotten papers. But there, between two dust-covered volumes, was a small, yellowed envelope. It was placed carelessly among the others, its corners slightly curled, as if it had been there for years, just waiting to be noticed. I opened it slowly, the paper crinkling under my fingers. Inside was a single sheet, folded neatly. The handwriting was familiar, Professor Vance's, of course. But the words, once again, were not what I expected. They were simple, almost apologetic. I was wrong. I should have told you all those years ago. But I was afraid. There was too much at stake, too many lives involved. It's not too late, though. Not yet. The truth will come out, but I fear it will be too late for me. The words, as vague and unfinished as they were, seemed to hold more weight than any confession I had ever heard. There was no dramatic admission, no desperate plea for forgiveness, just a quiet recognition of the past, a moment of clarity that came far too late to matter. In that one letter, in that single confession, I understood the case. Not in the way I'd expected, but in a deeper, quieter sense. Eleanor had been right, in a way. The past was never really gone, not completely. It lingered always in the spaces between the words we spoke and the things we left unsaid. And now, with the case closed, I found myself haunted by that same quiet truth. The truth that, no matter how hard we try, some things cannot be undone. I left the study and stood in the hallway for a moment, the weight of the letter in my hand. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the street slick and shining in the dim light. It was then that I realized the case had come to its quiet end, not with a dramatic flourish, but with the slow, inevitable retreat of what we had never fully understood. The answer had always been there, waiting in the silence. There was nothing more to be said. The truth had been laid bare, but not in the way we had imagined. And as I walked down the corridor, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the empty space, I knew that I had come to the end of this particular journey. For some answers, it seemed, were always meant to remain quiet, leaving us to reflect on them in the stillness long after the rain had stopped, to 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 the rain had stopped.